Let's talk about WoW. Let's talk about World of Warcraft. Tell me what the early days of developing WoW was like. Maybe we should talk about what World of Warcraft WoW is. Going to Perplexity here. World of Warcraft is a massively multiplayer online RPG where you create a character, level it up doing quests and dungeons, and progress your gear and power in an open fantasy world called Azeroth. At a basic level, you move, use abilities from your action bar, follow quests, and gradually learn a combat rotation that fits your class. And there's all kinds of characters and roles and classes. You pick a race, appearance, starting zone, small racial bonuses, and a class, how you fight, what your role is in groups. Can you continue fill in some of the gaps? What is World of Warcraft?
World of Warcraft, first of all, more than anything, is a world. Like, it's a world that you can live in with real other people, and everybody's kind of living out their fantasy. Chris Metzen, who was the creative director on World of Warcraft, and really like Alan Adham, who's one of the founders of Blizzard, calls Chris the heart and soul of Blizzard. And it's almost like when you're making a Blizzard game, you're making Chris's imagination at some point. And Chris famously said the lead character of World of Warcraft is the world. And I always believed that. So you're trying to create this place that's exciting and dangerous, but comfortable, but uncomfortable, and gorgeous. And, it should feel massive. And it really is. It's, can take a half an hour to get from one end of the world to the other. But it's this world you're living in. The world is divided into two warring factions. There's the Horde and the Alliance. And that was a very important, very controversial decision that was made by Alan Adham, was the champion of the Horde and Alliance.
And that in the early days, there was a really strong division.
Strong division.
Like,
Yeah.
you pick a side and then you hang around with only people your kind.
Yeah, and you get it tattooed in real life on you. Like, the amount of people who walk up to me and show me their Horde tattoo, like,
That's
it's
awesome.
epic. It's like,
Yeah.
it's become who they are. Like, if
Yeah.
you were to say, like, hey, Lex, come play World of Warcraft with me. We're Alliance on Tichondrius. You'd be like,
Right.
dude,
Lose my number.
Alliance. Like,
Yeah.
okay, I don't think we can be friends anymore.
Yeah.
But the Horde Alliance decision was really controversial because in EverQuest, it was mixed race. They had all the races kind of like WoW did, but they could all group with each other.
Mhm.
And Pardo and I came from EverQuest, where we felt like this was a horrible decision Alan was making. And we argued, Alan, Rob, Bob Fitch, and I would have lunch every single day. And we would just talk about WoW and the core design of WoW. Rob wasn't even on WoW at that time. He
Mhm.
was finishing Warcraft 3. And we would fight over the Horde Alliance split if it was a good idea or not. And Alan he came from more of the Dark Age of Camelot community, which was another massively multiplayer online game that was more PvP based.
Mhm.
And he said the magic of that game was they had 3 factions, and he liked the fact that you were instantly on a team. You weren't a loner in the world. And whether you liked it or not, you had people on your side. And Rob and I just argued and argued against it. And then sometime before beta, Alan retired. He went on to run a hedge fund, of all things, like got super into poker, got super into finance, left, and retires like, I think it was 9 months to a year before WoW shipped, which is kind of nuts. And Rob takes over as lead designer in Alan's stead. And to Rob's credit, the first thing he did was go, speaking to what we were speaking about earlier, he said, Alan's a smart guy. The fact that he was fighting so hard for Horde Alliance, we got to do it. And Rob and I sort of changed our point of view and got on board with Horde Alliance and went all in. And so, the early days of WoW it was a great team. It was a mix of these veterans that we all looked up to. We had Mark Kern running the team. Shane DeBerry was, you know, legendary Blizzard developer. Bill Petrus was the art director. And then we had Metzen, who was sort of like, Metzen was the cool big brother we all, aspired to
Mhm.
be. I'm older than Metzen, but I looked up to him like a big brother. And then there were a lot of us who had never done it before, or they had also pulled a lot of people from other teams and other game types. Like, for example, the guys building the dungeons, they hired out of the Quake community.
Mhm.
And because they didn't have any hardcore MMO designer on the staff at that time, it was, Kevin and Eric and Alan were sort of the only designers. They started building Quake dungeons
Mhm.
as like Quake levels as the dungeons. At one point, WoW was even made in QE Radiant, which was the Quake engine. And then
Mhm.
they later, retooled to where they were using a proprietary engine. So we were like this hodgepodge, like the Bad News Bears is how
Mhm.
I would describe the WoW team, of this mix of veterans and then people like me. Like, I'm just some fucking idiot, who played a lot of EverQuest.
Yeah.
And I end up at
Designing
Blizzard.
quests.
Yeah, like, okay, we're gonna design World of Warcraft now. Um, and I've said this later with hindsight. I think a huge part of WoW's success, especially with the early WoW team, Team 2 in its earliest formation, was that we didn't know what we were doing. You kind of like, it's that Titan was the example for me. Titan was the attempt at making an MMO after World of Warcraft at
Mhm.
Blizzard, and we failed horribly, and we had the best of the best on that team. And it's because everybody was too much of an expert on how to make a groundbreaking phenomenon MMO. World of Warcraft was a bunch of people, like a very successful, sure of itself company who had made StarCraft, Diablo, Warcraft, with a bunch of yahoos, basically, who was like, yeah, we can compete with Sony Online.
Yeah.
At the time, they were making EverQuest 2. Like, if we go back in the time machine, EverQuest 2 had been announced, and EverQuest fans, we were just drooling for EverQuest 2. It wasn't, oh, cool, World of Warcraft. It was EQ2 was going to take, the chalice and run with it. And then, of all things, they announced Star Wars Galaxies. And they had a brilliant designer on that, a guy named Raph Koster, who had come from that Ultima Online. And he's just a really smart game designer. If you can ever watch one of his lectures, like he lectured a lot at GDC, and we're like, oh my God, they're making EverQuest 2 and Star Wars Galaxies, and they have the Star Wars intellectual property. We're fucked.
Mhm.
Like, how are we gonna compete? And everybody had seen the success of EQ,
Mhm.
EverQuest, and everybody was gonna make an MMO, and it was just a question of who was gonna win.
So you're feeling this immense pressure. You have this small team of just this hodgepodge of this unlikely team that kind of looks fast forward into Overwatch, the heroes in Overwatch, but working extremely hard. Like you told me about crazy work hours, and not because you were forced to, but because you wanted to, because your heart was in it, because you're like, this is everything. Like you loved it.
Yeah, the games industry has a terrible reputation for insane amounts of overtime. It's just called crunch. Like, do you crunch or not? These days, crunch is not allowed, not permitted, heavily frowned upon. If we were to work overtime, somebody write an article about it next
Yeah.
week and say how horrible we are for working overtime. Um, Back then, we worked insane, and I mean insane hours. The longest shift I ever worked straight was 30 hours. That's when we were gold mastering Warcraft 3. This was in my, I think, War 3 shipped on July 3rd, 2002. So this would have been like late June, early July, probably late June. And I had nothing to do with War 3. I should just
Mhm.
say that. Like in the credits, I'm additional help or additional testing or something like that. Um, when I showed up in May of 2002, it was all hands on deck World of Warcraft for E3.
Mhm.
We got through E3 and then all hands on deck, the whole company, get War 3 out the door
For shipping
for
Warcraft 3.
shipping Warcraft 3. And because I had not been involved with the game at all, and I was a brand new, wet behind the ears game designer, they're like, "You're just gonna help test whatever we tell you to test."
Mhm.
So we're trying to gold master, and there's a crash that happens rarely if you run one of the cinematics. Like, you have to be watching the cinematic after one of the levels, and then there was a crash that happened. And so a programmer put in some logging to catch it, and then they needed somebody to just over and over again, "I need the crash to happen so I can fix the bug." And I sat there for 30 hours and just watched the cinematic for 30 hours
Mhm.
straight. And it was the funniest thing, like, it was almost surreal watching everybody leave at the which was a trickle out, like, everybody kinda trickles out, like, at
Mhm.
different hours, the family guys go much earlier than the single guys. And then watching everybody show up again the next morning, and they're all, like, dressed different, they look all
Mhm.
refreshed, and I'm just, like, in the same position,
Yeah.
like, eyes are beet red.
To the soundtrack of the cinematic, yeah,
Yeah.
yeah.
But we crunched World of Warcraft, we crunched the date slipped, so you do this thing. I remember Mark Kern standing the team up and saying, "We're gonna crunch early so we don't have to crunch later in the project."
Mhm.
And I really believe he wasn't manipulating us. Like, I
Mhm.
really genuinely believe that he believed in that.
Mhm.
But with games, anything can happen. And we slip uncontrollably all the time. And we slipped, and it sort of created just this death march, um, endless death march that, like, to this day, members of the WoW team will remember, like, Newport rib. If I say that, they'll have, like, twitches because, like, they would cater the dinner. They'd bring it in at, like, 6 or 7 at
Mhm.
night, and everybody was eating Newport rib or Panda Express. It was, like, the worst diet ever. I actually like Newport rib, no
Mhm.
shade on them,
Mhm.
but you can only eat so much of it,
Yeah.
and the carpets are stained and, like, dudes are falling asleep on the
Yeah.
couches, and it was an unhealthy work environment. It gets pinned on, 'cause at a lot of places it is executive driven
Mhm.
and it is mandated from the top, but the hours that I worked, I never blamed on anyone but myself. I just wanted to.
Mhm.
I remember, coming in on Memorial Day, like, with sand from the beach on my feet because I really wanted to get some work done that day
Mhm.
and working through Christmas, and those were things I wanted to do. I never felt like somebody, held my feet to the coals.
Yeah, it's such a complicated thing because, yeah, okay, you could say that's unhealthy, but I know a large number of people, especially in their 20s, but actually throughout their career, that have been in companies that do crunch for a thing they believe in, for a thing they love, and it's some of the most fulfilling years of their life, months and years of their life. And they also, it's not just fulfilling; they grow from it, they learn from it, and and when they, especially when they talk back about it, about that time, they can see how incredible it was. Of course, when you're going through it, sometimes it's extremely difficult. You don't know. And then the crunch, like you mentioned, it's supposed to be a month or two, and then it turns out to be a half a year, and then maybe it turns out to be something like a Titan type game where you never actually ship it, and it's heartbreaking and the pain that's all. But then you look back and you realize how incredible that journey was.
I think like my reflections on it many years later and having gone through like pretty crazy levels of crunch to more controlled, I think where crunch is problematic and people are good to be vocal about being opposed to it is when it's forced and unnecessary. There's a lot of like, hey, if anybody on the team stays, we all stay,
Hmm.
kind of,
Yeah.
which I think is not necessary. I don't think executives who take off and work 40-hour weeks should be telling anybody to stay late. I
Hmm.
think that's wrong and immoral. But to me, as an individual, as long as I'm not telling other people to do it, my life's work is my passion. And I want to do it as much as possible. I find myself, I don't think I've ever worked less than 10 hours in a day. Like that 10 hours is like a normalish day to
Yeah,
me.
yeah.
Um, and I enjoy lots of weekends working because I enjoy it. It brings me pleasure and fulfillment. And all of that said from a place of caution, especially in this era when people are very touchy about it. I don't try to impose that on anybody else. I don't want anybody to feel like they're obligated to, but please understand it's what makes me who I am, that work ethic. I
Mhm.
enjoy it. I actually, some of my fondest memories are from those WoW crunches.
And then looking back and reading some of these stories is pretty cool because me as a fan on the receiving end of some of those video games, you bring joy to millions of people. It's awesome.